My name's Matt McKinney. I'm co-facilitator with Daryl of the Water and Tribes Initiative, and I'm going to just introduce this panel and then help moderate discussion a little bit. This panel is focused on the intersection of science and governance in the management of the Colorado River, beginning with the assumptions about water supply at the time of the 1922 compact. And we heard some remarks and reflections about that earlier this morning, and these folks will pick up on that. And then move that conversation about the role of science, the place of science, particularly over the past couple of decades, responding to and dealing with climate change and the Megadrought. So we have a terrific panel that's going to help lead this discussion. John Fleck is going to start with about 20 minutes of perspective. John is a writer in residence and a professor of water policy and governance at the University of New Mexico. He's written a couple of books on water, including one with Eric Kuhn titled Science Be Damned, How Ignoring Inconvenient Science Drained the Colorado River. Well worth the time to read, and I'm sure John will reflect on that. And then John will be followed by Connie Woodhouse. Connie is a Regents Professor in the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on climatology and hydrology in the West, using both observed data as well as paleoclimatic data from tree rings. And so she'll be reflecting on that a little bit. And then last not least, James Prairie is the hydrologic engineer for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. He leads applied research in short and mid-term operations and long-term water resource planning, climate variability, and decision support under uncertainty. So we could not have a better panel to address the question of science and governance. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here with both of these people because, and Jim may not even remember this, but both of them have helped me write books because I don't have a whole lot of my own ideas. I just borrow from the smart people that I collaborate with on these books. But a lot of what I've written over the last many years, especially about the Colorado River Basin, has really focused on the interface between science and governance, how we use science to inform the political and policy decisions we make and how science sort of funnels through institutions. And I was really struck by something Larry McDowell said this morning about the framers of the Colorado River Compact and how they were coming together to invent a form to do something that no one had ever done before. It's doing something for the first time. And this applies to the science of that time period as well. And what we were doing as a growing nation, wanting to bring the West, the arid West, into 20th century economy, required actions on a scale that had never been attempted before on this continent. And it required, therefore, a scientific understanding and approach to science at a scale that had never been attempted before. So just like the institutional folks, the Delph Carpenters, Herbert Hoovers of the world were trying to build an institutional widget in the Colorado River Compact, the scientists who they were working with or choosing not to work with in some cases were working at and trying to understand the function of the Colorado River and the basin as a whole system. And we'd never had to do that before. Human communities had acted at much smaller scales with much more local understandings. And so the process of trying to understand how the basin functioned as a whole, how the river functioned as a whole, was a new sort of endeavor. And it was an endeavor that was a creature of government. these were government scientists who did this work back then. The institution of science at that kind of scale was something that was even then being invented by, especially the U.S. Geological Survey, and also the then Reclamation Service. What we're left with today, in trying to look back and understand what happened then and how it leads to where we are today, is an understanding of the interaction between two sorts of risks that we face in the 21st century with aridification and climate change. We have hydrologic risks, right? How much water is there in the river? A lot less, as we know. And I have my classic, still a journalist, the cracked mud photo. We love our cracked mud photos in journalism. And that's a demonstration of hydrologic risk, but we also have this institutional risk. Those are the framers of the Colorado River Compact photographed at Bishop's Lodge in the fall of 1922. And what happens is science and water are funneled through institutions in a way that yields the results on the landscape that are our farms and our cities and the 40 million people across the western United States, southwestern United States, and northern Mexico who depend on this river and the 5 million acres. It is that hydrology funneled through institutions. And the risk we face today is a result of how those two things interact. And I think it's really important to understand in general, but especially as we reflect back on the centennial of the Compact, how we got to this point. And that's that was the subject of the book that Eric Kuhn and I wrote, Science Be Damned, looking at the history of science throughout the basin, but really especially looking at the history of how science was done and used or not used in the 1920s when these decisions were being made. And when we were putting together the book, one of the editors that we had a conversation with at a publisher who chose not to buy the book was interested in the characters. We had this sort of heroic character, I'll talk about him, Eugene Clyde LaRue, who was doing science, and the counterpoint was Arthur Powell Davis, who Larry McDowell talked about, who was the Reclamation Service lead at the time. And the editor who was, we were pitching the book to, wanted us to make Arthur Powell Davis a villain, and I don't think that's right at all. These were both people trying to do the best that they could at the time, but they both had very different approaches. And I want to talk about both of these men, what they did, how they approached the science that was used to inform the Colorado River Compact or to not inform the Colorado River Compact. And I love the picture of LaRue on the left. If you look for pictures of LaRue, there's this great collection of them in the USGS archives. And he's this, tanned guy out in the field taking field notes and measuring the flow of waters in stream, the sort of, the field scientist out measuring the river. And Arthur Powell Davis is always in a suit and a tie. I don't know if we have any pictures of him, Eric, other than in a suit and a tie. And Davis was the representative of the Reclamation Service and the federal government in search of a way to enable the development of the West. And they had very different approaches, and I want to talk about that. LaRue's story, it's great to tell the story of LaRue here in Salt Lake City, because LaRue's story starts, I think, for us in the Great Salt Lake. LaRue is trying to measure and understand the flow of the Colorado River. They only had gauge records, as Larry McDowell pointed out, going back to 1902. But LaRue was a curious scientist, and he wanted to know, well, how representative is that gauge record we have of a longer period of time? And he turned to the Great Salt Lake, where at the time they had excellent records of the rise and fall of the elevation of the lake, which LaRue hypothesized represented wetter or drier periods of climate, and did these clever calculations, which Eric is smarter than I am at understanding, to infer flows on the Colorado River. Colorado River Basin is kind of in the same latitudinal gradient, and came up with the very first proxy of flows on the Colorado River. And if you look to sort of first order, and this is an analysis Eric did of LaRue's calculation. LaRue's is the red line, and it's going back in the 1860s. You have a wet period and you have a dry period, and then you have that wet period, and the yellow line is the actual instrumental record. And what LaRue was able to do using this proxy record was say to people, you know, the flows that we have had on the Colorado River in the last 2 decades, on which they had the gauge record and Basin compact, those are unusually wet. There are these other dry times. You should consider those in your decision making. And in a report that he wrote, Water Supply Paper 395 in 1916, he wrote very explicitly, the flow of the Colorado River and its tributaries is not sufficient to irrigate all the irrigable lands within the basin. Black and white. Interestingly, he said it rather late in the report. He didn't emphasize it a lot, but it was clear. This is not some, you know, there were flaky lefty environmental NGOs back then. This is the USGS scientists we as a nation have hired and given the job of telling us how much water this river has so we can do all this stuff. And he's saying, y'all, there's not enough water here to do things that are quite that large. Arthur Powell Davis, representing Reclamation, representing the desire to develop the basin, representing the desire to motivate an agreement that would become the Colorado River Compact, offered a different conclusion. He offered a technical report produced, you know, by his agency to the compact negotiators, which suggested sufficient water for the irrigation of all the lands. And this is a quote from the opening meeting of the Colorado River Compact Commission in early 1922. So you have the tension between two ways of thinking about the river. One motivated by the desire to do development and to come to an agreement among the states, an agreement that was necessary in order to enable the development. Scientifically reasonable to say, we have a gauge record, let's use that. And the compact commissioners certainly agreed with him. And on the other hand, you have Eugene Clyde LaRue saying, maybe not enough water. And again, this is an official US government scientist and official US government report. The compact commissioners, and I think this is a point Eric has made, I think really thoughtfully, showed a lack of curiosity about the answers to these questions. LaRue was never brought before the commission. Clearly, the representatives of the states were happy to see Davis's assurance that that they had a 20 million acre foot river to work with. That made their task a lot easier because they all wanted to do development too. And so we saw LaRue in 1916 with the first water supply paper report. The compact was negotiated in 1922. LaRue issued a second, much more detailed, rigorous, and clear warning in 1925. And it's in that gap that Larry McDowell talked about this morning between the 1922 negotiation of the compact and its final ratification in 1928 and 29. So, and there was, when Eric and I were working on the book, I was reading congressional testimony, and there was this amazing moment where LaRue is testifying before a Senate committee, and he opens his testimony with that quote, "Not enough water to irrigate all the lands y'all want to irrigate." And I'm paging through this congressional hearing, page after page after page after page, and none of the senators asked him. There was never a follow-up question, suggesting they didn't want to hear it either. And so when in the title of our book we talk about ignoring inconvenient science, I mean there was at times a willful ignoring of that science, and LaRue was not alone. There were others. We saw this continuing process through the 20th century as the river got smaller. The boosters, those who favored development, continuing to kind of want to favor the more optimistic analyses. of how much water there was. So this was not an isolated incident. This is the most important because we're talking about the cornerstone. We're talking about the foundation of the law of the Colorado River, and it was based on a flawed understanding of the science. And the story that, and this is a story I've told for many years until I started working with Eric and realized the story wasn't right. Well, they just had 20 years of gauge record. It just happened to be an unusually wet time. They did the best that they could with what they had. What rotten luck. And I think the story of LaRue suggests an important cautionary tale because it suggests that when you are making decisions that depend on science, you have to be careful to remain curious and to listen to the scientists who have some inconvenient science on offer. So how long did this last? It's really interesting because the character who I think was most early and publicly and visibly forthright about the fact that there ain't enough water was Floyd Dominy, the famous character, elaborately story told in Cadillac Desert, Mike Reisner's Cadillac Desert, flamboyant, bigger, larger than life character, tremendous booster of the development of the river. And in the 1960s, when Congress was debating the Colorado River Basin Project Act, which would enable the construction of the Central Arizona Project, because at that time, there was still plenty of water because we hadn't built enough infrastructure to use all the allocations that the Colorado River Compact had offered up on paper. And Floyd Dominy went before Congress, again, sounding oddly like LaRue in the mid-1960s, and said, when you build the Central Arizona Project, there's not going to be enough water to keep it full. There will not be enough water. And by that time, the analyses that were done with the sort of the very first versions of the modeling stuff that Jim works with today, that was first starting to be available, and they were starting to do these early modeling analyses of the Colorado River, made it clear that even this is well before we understood the implications of climate change, that there was only sufficient water when you built the Central Arizona Project for it to be full some of the time and empty or close to empty some of the time. It was going to be a variable supply. It was not going to be a full aqueduct. There was not going to be enough water for Arizona to take its whole 2.8 million acre feet that had been given it in the Arizona v. California decree. But Dominy remained enthusiastic, right? Because if you read his testimony of that time period, again, he's a booster. It was going to be about augmentation. We were going to be building desal plants or giant canals from the Columbia River or stuff like that. And so that was going to be the answer. And so it was a continuation of this, the sort of technological enthusiasm that in the 1920s had allowed them to essentially ignore the science from LaRue and say, we're going to go ahead and build a giant dam at Boulder Canyon or Black Canyon. It gave people what they needed to charge ahead, and they charged ahead. And even by the time the 68 Act was passed, it was clear that augmentation probably was not even a realistic possibility then. It certainly, very soon after became clear we're not going to see large-scale augmentation, but we charged ahead anyway. And the problems that we see today really didn't start manifesting themselves. If you look at the graphs, you see the problems really start to come to the fore, in the late 90s when the Central Arizona Project is full and Arizona is finally taking its full allotment, and Dominy's projection, absent the part about augmentation, then became the reality that we're living with today. And that was even before climate change. And so the reality we have today would be the problem that we're dealing with even without climate change, but then climate change made it worse. And to sort of hint a little bit to what Connie's going to talk about, in the 1970s we saw the first really sophisticated tree ring reconstruction, Stockton and Jacoby in 1976, which sort of confirmed and expanded on greatly the sort of early insights of LaRue, showing that the first few decades of the 20th century were so unusually wet, and a caution that we're only recently getting finally the hang of listening to, that if you base your period of record in analyzing the river's flow, and you include those, that you have to be careful about including those early years of the 20th century because they skew the record. And I think today, in a couple of ways, we've gotten much more sophisticated, and I have all praise for the technical folks at the Bureau of Reclamation and their approach to things now. The state of the science policy interface, science politics policy interface now is much healthier. These far more sophisticated approaches to really understanding the envelope of variability of risks we face and how the science and the hydrology funnels into the political and policy interface that determines who gets how much water and how we sort of spread it out across the ground. So, Connie.
All right, I'm going to have some slides up in a second, but I can talk about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to pick up the thread that John tossed out on Stockton Jacoby's first real reconstruction of the Colorado River. But before I do that, I want to mention that actually in the 1940s, there was an earlier scientist, Edmund Schulman, who developed a proxy record for the Colorado River in a report that he did for Los Angeles Bureau of Power and Light. So even back then, there was interest in understanding the variability of the Colorado River over a long-term context on the behalf of resource managers. Their interest was more in power, but still they were starting to look at that. And so the science of tree rings, dendrochronology was pretty early. It was pretty early years for that, so that was kind of innovative. But just onto Stockton Jacoby, this is what the reconstruction looked like. It was the first calibrated reconstruction, so it was actually calibrating ring widths with a gauge record to develop a reconstruction of stream flow. And it started in 1564 and ended in 1962, and it showed three important things. One is that the long-term average was 3.5 million acre feet, which was considerably less than had been allocated. The other was what John mentioned, the timing of the compact. 1922, where that arrow is obviously coming at the end of the wettest period in that entire time period. And then the third element that they showed was this period of severe sustained drought in the beginning of the record in the late 1500s. So three elements that were probably not welcome news to resource managers, and by and large, this record was either discounted or ignored. Because it was an inconvenient thing to consider, but also I think because at the time, the end of the 1970s, 1977, the year after it came out, was an incredibly dry year, but the years that followed for the most part were relatively wet. The 1980s was pretty wet. We had some drought years in the end of the 1980s and the 1990s, but it was a fairly wet period of time, and so that people weren't talking about drought or shortages very much. Of course, that changed in 2000. And about that time also, the late 1990s, early 2000s, my colleague Dave Miko and I and our colleagues started to go out and recollect some of the tree ring collections that had been done that had supported Stockton Jacoby's reconstruction to update those. So by the early 2000s, we had a new reconstruction. We actually did a couple different ones. This is the one that Dave led, starts in 762 and goes up to 2005, so really expands the range that Stockton Jacoby had in their reconstruction. But in a lot of ways, it was not very different. A lot of the features are pretty close. So we mostly, for all of our work, extended it forward and backward in time, but it still has the same message. So this reconstruction, when it came out, one of the things that was really alarming, it seemed, to water managers was this 5-year period, 2000 to 2004 being a really extreme 5-year period. And the question that was being asked was, well, has it been this bad before? Has it been worse? And our timing with the reconstruction was really good. We were able to say, well, we can look at that. And so this time series is a 5-year running average. The the thin line. And so that red line intersects with the 5-year running average for 2000 and 2004, and then all the others in the record. So you can see that period is pretty rare, although we certainly, it looks like, have had 5-year periods that were at least as extreme or even more extreme than that period going back in time. And you also might notice that those 5-year periods are not spread out evenly, but they tend to cluster in time. So we were there with an answer to a question that was being asked. It also didn't help that this reconstruction, particularly in the 2000s, the trees were really matching what the gauge record was showing. Obviously, the reconstruction is not a gauge record. It has uncertainties. This kind of a record, we're explaining about 75-ish% of the variability in the gauge record. So not perfect, but at this point, it was being assessed and deemed to be useful. It was also giving resource managers and others an idea of the range of variability that occurred in the past, with the idea that, maybe this is something that should be looked at. Before this time, the gauge record was considered to be the record for planning containing the worst-case scenario of the 1950s. And then having this kind of a record allowed resource managers to look back in time to assess whether their planning worst-case scenarios were prudent or not. And so for a lot of, my sense was at the time in the early 2000s, climate change, of course, was being talked about, but not in every circle. And in some cases, it was just not something that resource managers wanted to talk about politically. They weren't denying it, but it was not something that you would, broadcast in certain political circles, I should say. So this kind of a record gave resource managers something to look at to expand their sort of range of planning that was relatively safe. Tree rings were pretty credible, as opposed to looking at that mess of projections into the future that were just, the early spaghetti plots didn't instill a lot of confidence. So the tree ring records served in that capacity. There certainly were some challenges to using these things. For the agencies that used water resource models, like the Reclamation CRS model, we have one reconstruction for one gauge. It's a water year stream flow record. CRSS runs on monthly time steps, and what is it like? 20 nodes, 20 spatial nodes. And so Jim, I don't think you're going to talk about this, but was really instrumental in disaggregating this record temporally and spatially, so it could be run through the CRS model, so that, for example, they could look at what Lake Mead was doing in the 1100s during that really period of bad drought. So that was really started to make this information more operational. That being said, this paleo record gives us a lot of information about past climate variability. It contains droughts that we've just not seen over the 20th and over the 20th century, especially the 1100s drought. However, we now are fully aware that the climate of the past is not like the climate of the current climate, or what we can expect in the future. And so the paleo record is just not an analog for the future. It can be used as a guide for expectations of natural variability. But when we use the paleo record for thinking about what the future could look like, of course, now we need to add warming, because any future drought is going to be some combination of natural variability plus the impacts of warming, which we've found can be quite considerable. So I think I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Jim.
Thanks, Connie. So I'm going to build from where Connie spoke about that drought from 2000, 2004, and that's about the time I started my career with Reclamation. And what really I saw it as is it was this point of an opportunity for science to step in a way that it hadn't before. So with that drought, one of the things we started to recognize was that, let's see if I can get this guy, was that we had an event that was occurring where we saw observed conditions that were unlike anything we'd seen in the last 90 years. And all of a sudden, this concept that we can use the last 90 years to project what's going to happen in the future started to fall apart a little bit. And that was a key opportunity for us to bring in new science and start to incorporate that into the work we were doing. And what I'm showing here is that similar figure to what Connie showed. You're looking at the MECO reconstruction going back to about 760. And then you're also seeing a reconstruction that Connie did a year earlier in orange. And then in green, you're seeing the observed period. And that observed period was at that time showing a flow that we hadn't seen in the last 90 years. But that paleo data that Connie and Dave developed did show the possibility of that. So that was a door for really Reclamation to step through to say, we need to look at more than just the observed record. And really it started around the impetus of developing the new 2007 interim guidelines that we wanted to do that. And the first way Reclamation brought this into decision-making was doing a sensitivity analysis. That was included in the 2007 interim guidelines, where it looked at, really the decision was based on the observed 90-plus year record, but there was a sensitivity to how did the paleo information show changes to the risks they were looking at. And that was a key component of our first steps into moving away from just the observed record. So the other thing that happened at the same time was Reclamation, recognizing that we had to continue to advance our science, started to look at how can we further bring information in that could be informative. And the global climate models, as Connie said, were coming about at that time as something that was important. We didn't know how to bring them into the process yet, but we knew we had to delve into that science. So there was a program set up that really started working with academics, researchers, and folks outside of Reclamation to help inform us of what is this GCM science telling us? How do we bring it into our efforts? And that was a critical part of our program, was trying to bring that science in and figuring out how to use it in decision making. And one of the first places that that science started to come in was when we started working towards the 2012 Basin Study. And that was a pretty unprecedented study. Nothing had done at that scale before. And that study was going to be looking at that supply and demand imbalance that we've all been speaking about and trying to look at it in more detail and dive into not just the supply side, but also the demand side. But on the supply side, we wanted to use this as an opportunity to start to look at the global climate models and figure out how to bring those in and look at the information from them. And one of the first things we started seeing as we did this, so I'll also note that, at this was one of the first times we're trying to look at the global climate models. But one of the things I wanted to bring out here was we started to look at it through different time periods. And in gray here, you're seeing the natural flow record that was used during the 2007 interim guidelines. And what you're seeing on the left-hand side there is a figure of Lake Powell less than 3490. So it's the risk of Lake Powell dropping below 3490 or minimum power pool. And what we're seeing is the risk that was determined during the 2007 interim guidelines is shown in gray shading below, and that risk is fairly low. I think that risk, I cannot see from here, but below about 2%. And that was the risk we were seeing based on the hydrology knowledge we had, the state of the system at that point. And as we worked towards the 2012 Basin Study, we started looking at other forms of hydrology. The green is adding more data on. And you can see that as you move to adding just additional data onto the natural flow record, that risk we're looking at shifts. It starts getting a little higher. And then if you bring in the global climate model information, and I'm showing two forms of it here. During the 2012 Basin Study, we were working with the Coupled Modeling Error Comparison Project 3, which was the data that was coming out at that time. That's in purple. In blue, I'm showing data that's come out since then, the Coupled Modeling Error Comparison 5. And one of the things you can see that's very different from those is they have a wide range of what plausible future hydrologies might look at. And when you start looking at those, you can see that the risk looks different on each of those as well. And the key piece we also saw is that wide range makes it more difficult to start to say, we can make a decision on that risk. It's so wide ranging that folks didn't want to believe it or understand, how do we incorporate this? And that became a bit of a hurdle in using the global climate model information. So the next big study that came out after the 2012 Basin Study, well, before I go there, one of the things we did look at is because of that high risk and the high range of uncertainty, could we look at this a little differently? And one of the first things we did during the 2012 Basin Study is we started working with the RAND Corporation, and we started bringing in these concepts of deep uncertainty, and they call it robust decision-making. And robust decision-making said, we're not going to work to choose a scenario to run through your model. We're going to run through as many scenarios as we can, and we're going to look for where are vulnerabilities in your system. And the concept of vulnerability could be, what are your risks of dropping below 3490? And you could start to say, I want to look at not just risk, but I want to look at what's driving me towards that. And that became a concept that we wanted to explore more, and we began that in the Basin Study. Unfortunately, as we were leading up beyond the Basin Study, we started having the drought continuing. So we're working kind of in the near term. The Basin Study was looking 50 years in the future. It allowed us to understand the imbalance, but it still didn't address what was starting to happen in the near term. And one of the things that was happening in the near term was the need for the drought contingency planning you've been hearing about. That was more immediate. That was looking out 5 years. Global climate models really become more important as these emission scenarios start to build out over 20, 50 years. In the near term, what was important was what's going to happen in the next 5 years. And one of the things that was brought about, and I believe Eric was one of the ones to help think about this concept, was what if we just don't use that full 100-year record that goes back to 1906? We know there's some wet periods there. What if we use the drought we've been experiencing and maybe a little bit of data beyond that? And they developed a stress test data set, which was extracted from the observed data, but more in the near term of what we've seen recently. And the other key thing of that stress test period, which began in 1988, is that's the period when we've been seeing this spike in warming, where this warming trend has been building up, and it's continued to build through this whole drought, creating things like the hot drought you heard about today. So using just that limited period, which is shown in orange, we see the risk yet shift again. So one of the key things you're seeing out of this is your choice of a scenario to run through this model is going to influence the risk you're going to see coming out of that model. That makes it pretty tricky because now we have to start really deciding, okay, can we agree on which scenario we think is the most plausible for the future? Is it the GCM scenario? Is it the stress test when the near term is worse than the GCMs? This starts to be a key concept that we've been trying to work through. And what Reclamation's been doing really the last 5 to 6 years is diving into this decision-making under deep uncertainty. And it's a concept that we internally have been working to build out tools, and we really hope to be rolling that out in the next few months to the early next year as a possible new method to help assist us as we start working into the post-2026 work. And another way to kind of look at that is this figure now is taking all those scenarios, the whole observed record, the GCM data, and looking at them all together. So you can create 332 different futures with all that information. That's all being shown to you as a spaghetti plot. But what we want to look at is that critical information we want here is what is a condition that's going to lead us to dropping below 3490? That's what's of interest in this figure. And what we can start to see is there are about 33 traces out of that those 300 plus traces that lead us to dropping below 3490 in the next 5 years. And we want to say, what is the driver of that? And what this analysis let us do is look at this, and we could see that if we have a 5-year flow from 2021 to 2026 that is in the order of less than 11.4 million acre feet, we have a high propensity of getting this vulnerability. So what we now have is an indicator independent of a scenario telling us what's leading us to those vulnerabilities. And what we can also look at this and see is that from 2008 to 2021, 2000 to 2021, we realized a flow of about 12.3. So getting really close to that level that we saw as an indicator of vulnerability. And then we can see from the period, the recent 5-year period, 2017 to 2017 to 2021, we're at 11.5. So we are at that threshold of this vulnerability of 3490. And that's why the current runs we've been seeing out of modeling that is more recent, this is actually a run done from August of 2020. If we're looking at the current run, we're seeing that risk at about 25% right now. We're a little over that. So we're just seeing that these types of tools could work as indicators for us that are independent of this choice of hydrology. This shifting risk is something that is not really allowing us to say there's a given hydrology we can use that's going to inform us with confidence of what's happening in the future. It's really this need of looking at it in a different frame of what are we vulnerable to, what are the flows, and then tracking those flows. And this comes about from work that was really done back in 2008. So Chris Milley at that time put out a paper that said stationarity is dead. And I think we've been working to figure out how do we work with the information we have to incorporate the concept of stationary is dead, which means we can't depend on the information we've saw from the past to tell us the future. We need to use information that has the changes we're experiencing moving into the future, or information like this, which is looking at vulnerable conditions and saying, what are they? Can we track them? And those will be information that'll tell us if we're heading in a direction we need to be ready to be operating towards.
Thanks, guys. Terrific. We've got a few really good questions here. Let me just call out and ask if others here in the room or online want to add some additional questions. We'll try and get to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes or so. Jim, maybe I'm going to start with this one, kind of picking up on what you were just talking about. Question is, what's the next step for science and its role in management, given that we've known for quite some time we're in a severe drought, and that the compact was drafted during a wet period? What's the next step for science and its role?
I mean, I think what science really needs to do at this point is kind of what we're describing here, is taking the information we have in front of us and working to distill it in a form that's going to help decision makers be able to understand, under this wide range of what possibly could happen in the future, how can you make a better decision? And really, it's going to be realizing that we need to make decisions that can work across that wide range of plausible futures and have in place guidelines that can operate under those. I think that's the key piece.
Okay. John or Connie? Another question, is the impact from forest fires and changes in stream flow being taken into account with these models?
Probably not directly if you're talking about a GCM. I mean, it's something they're looking at right now as they try and understand the impacts of land surface changes, but really the increasing temperature and the changes of emissions are probably greater change than what's happening under the fires.
Okay.
I can add to that. I get that question with the tree ring reconstructions, if, there were forest fires in the past, because when we do reconstructions, we're relying on sort of large-scale precipitation that affects not just the watershed, but the tree growth. So it's not that the trees aren't sensing the water in the river directly. So people say, well, if you have big fires and burn down a bunch of the forest, then there's that the connection isn't as clear. But we've done some work to look at periods in the instrumental record where there have been fires and look at stream flow that would be influenced by the trees down, and then a gauge further down. It seems like a very transient kind of a response. I don't know if you have. So I don't think it's.
Yeah, I just want to add, going back to some of the very early 20th century science that was done, and this actually points to some work that I'm doing for a new book, looking at the early work of Aldo Leopold, the forester and conservationist, who was looking in this early period in the 1920s, when these early decisions were being made, about changes on the forest landscape. And one of Leopold's really important insights is that from the beginning of the time that we started doing science like this, we were in a constant state of disturbance of these forests. So we should not think that there was a stable system in these forests that is now being disturbed. We've been disturbing it the whole time.
Okay. John, maybe start with you on this one. Aren't data questions also partly political? Davis had the reputation and status to be in the room for the compact negotiations and was building relationships, so his data got used, not the USGS.
Sure, absolutely. And one of the really important things about Eugene Clyde LaRue was that he was kind of a jerk, and perhaps did not serve his cause well. But more importantly, and underlying it, is this deeply embedded natural set of cognitive biases that we as human beings have. And you see this over and over again in the sort of science policy world, where people are more likely to be sympathetic with or convinced by the science that supports their value position. This is a problem, period. And so certainly Davis was offering some science that those people would be sympathetic with, and LaRue was not. This is a problem to be guarded against at all times, but also to recognize this is just part of what happens. That's part of what happens at the science policy and politics interface.
Okay. Anyone else? Connie, Jim? Okay. Jim, does the Bureau anticipate updating the 2012 Basin Study?
So there's not plans on the books right now to update the Basin Study. I mean, with the upcoming interim guidelines, we'll be addressing a lot of the topics that were brought up in the Basin Study, really looking at flow, looking at demands, and trying to develop a new set of guidelines to work under the information we have in front of us today.
Okay. Let me see. Please, John, go right ahead.
So, yeah, I have a question for Jim, because I've been fascinated by watching the evolution of the institutional attitudes toward the stress test in particular. As you are working with stakeholders who need to use spaghetti plots like these, how important or useful is it to anchor them to the lived experience of the water managers who went through that time period, and does the stress test help with that problem, and how does that balance against the need to more broadly understand the full sort of envelope of risk, sort of the acceptability and versus the sort of technical merits of the broader?
Now, I would say it's critical. I mean, I think it's something like in the very beginning, we were talking about just moving to paleo data. We had to tie it to the observed. And Connie had spoke about this before, and I don't know if you mentioned it. When we were working with the paleo data, there was still, even in early 2000, a lot of folks were not comfortable with it. So we developed a method that blended the state information or the wet dry information with paleo. We had a lot of confidence in that. We didn't have as much confidence with the magnitude data. So we blended the observed with the paleo as a stepping stone to let us move in a little different way. And I think we're still doing that with even the GCM science. I mean, right now folks are still a little skeptical of that, like that range, but we're saying it's plausible, and you can look at the paleo to help you see the plausibility of these low flows, these low periods. And I think just helping to tie it to what we're observing has been essential, I would say.
Okay. Next question is the definition of drought being adapted as the baseline flow declines with climate change. Can you say we are in a drought period if it's a new normal? How does that affect drought planning?
I'll take a first crack, but let's go. I mean, I think I personally try not to get caught up on whether this is a drought or a new normal. What's in front of us is, a condition that we need to work with. As far as the new normal, if we can develop operations that can work at the levels we're experiencing or we may expect to be experiencing, I think we'll be able to address this, whether it's a new normal or drought, because if it's just a drought and we go back, we have knowledge of how to operate in that space. So it's really just being able to operate across this wide range and have what we would term robust operations is probably the critical piece of this.
Some years ago, I gave a talk to a group of scientists from NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System, and the title of the talk, I can't find these slides, it was a really long time ago, was something like, "Stop calling it drought." And I completely failed at taking my own advice because I've been writing about this for many years and I use the word drought all the time. But I think Jim hit on something really important, that drought carries some baggage that may not be helpful. And Brad Udall has poked us all to consider using the word aridification, which is both a terrible word and also really useful because it suggests a permanent process of drying, whereas drought suggests a temporary phenomenon that will be replaced by its opposite. But it's really important to note that we don't have a word for the opposite of drought in our language. And actually we do, the word is pluvial, but like who else used the word pluvial in the last year, right? In other words, over time, as we think about droughts, even before climate change, when things went up and down and we got to the upside, which was really an unusually wet side, we treated that as the normal. And so the way we use the word drought is so problematic. And I'm sorry, I still use it, but I try.
Okay. What kind of policies or procedural requirements would be needed to force the compact to address these more accurate flow estimates?
We're going to have a lot of time to talk about this tomorrow. But in short, the things that we're already doing, right? This is what, I mean, I see a whole bunch of faces of basin management people in the room right now. This is what they're working on. This is what they're doing now. Forcing, the hydrology is forcing this discussion. And the discussion is really active now. So I'm not sure we need any more forcing mechanisms than Lake Powell dropping below 35.25 and Lake Mead dropping below, what is it, 1065, 1064, you said? Yeah, the forcing is underway.
Okay. Jim, Connie, good. All right, maybe one more. Let me see here. There's a series of questions, and Jim, maybe you're sort of start with you, but just in terms of how current modeling is or isn't addressing evapotranspiration for agriculture, whether there's agreement more or less on those numbers, hotter temperatures leading to changes in evapotranspiration out of the reservoir. So how are those variables being taken into consideration?
I mean, I would say those variables are being taken into consideration right now. I think the key element that we're actively working on the science side to incorporate better is this impact of increasing temperature. I mean, really, we know this is occurring. It's a very clear record. Colorado Basin is really the canary in the coal mine as far as seeing this in the instrumental record now. And what we're doing is we're actually right now working with the states and with other stakeholders to improve our method to estimate agricultural consumptive use. And really, we're trying to use a method that's more up to date than the Blaney-Criddle method, which has been used for 40 years. And it's because of the impacts of things like temperature and changes in precipitation and just better measurements. So in my mind, we're trying to advance the science to kind of keep up with the changes we're seeing. We're doing the same things in reservoir evaporation. We've been reevaluating evaporation coefficients at Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the two largest reservoirs. And the idea is as we get those developed, we then incorporate that into the modeling. And that's a continual process that is always happening. So really the goal for us is to keep always engaged with the scientific community, learning how these advances can be brought into the tools and then working to bring them in. And I think that's one of our goals.
Connie or John? Good. All right, can we give these guys a round of applause, please? So I think with that, I'm going to invite Bob to come up. And let's see, our last panel, Bob Adler, Nora, and Jennifer, if you guys want to make your way down.
This is one of the premier events and sessions of our annual symposium. It includes the Wallace Stegner Lecture today. The session is entitled Law and the Living Colorado River. Law is supposed to reflect societal values. It's supposed to change as those values evolve. And thinking about the compact, as we've already heard, some values that certainly today we consider as important, just were not part of the considerations early on. Both in terms of values of the river and in terms of groups interested in the river and its health, particularly the living health of the river. So we will hear about that during the lecture today and by our respondents on the panel. I'm going to introduce our Wallace-Stegner lecturer in just a moment, but let me first introduce the panelists. Jennifer Pitt with the National Audubon Society, and Nora Mcdowell with the Fort Mojave Indian Tribe. Thank you for being with us today. Let me now introduce the 2022 Wallace-Stegner Distinguished Lecturer, my friend, my colleague, my former dean, a faculty member here at the College of Law for, I believe it's 27 years, also a hiking partner, at least when I can keep up with him, and that is Professor Bob Adler. He also, I will confess, even in public, has essentially been the de facto co-director of the Stegner Center. I've turned to Bob many, many, many times over the years for his advice and guidance, and always found it extraordinarily on point and helpful as we move ahead with the evolution of the Wallace-Stegner Center. Bob Adler is one of the nation's leading legal authorities on water law and water quality. He's also the author of Restoring Colorado River Ecosystems, A Troubled Sense of Immensity. He's eminently qualified to join the list of distinguished prior Wallace-Stegner lecturers at our annual symposium. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce my friend, my colleague, Bob Adler. I thought I'd enjoy them. You might want all of them. You got it.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was a very kind and gracious introduction, except for him trying to steal my lecture notes, which would be a little bit of a problem. And thank you all for being here and for sticking it out. I know it's been a long day. I'll try to make this as painless as possible. As Bob mentioned, I have been affiliated with the Stegner Center for 27 years now. I've been at the law school for 28 years, more than a quarter century. So it is really, truly an honor to have been asked to give the 2022 Stegner lecture. And I actually designed the lecture to try to mirror the Stegner Center itself. As Bob mentioned, this is among our premier programs of the year. Our research program works on many of the issues that I'll be talking about from a substantive perspective. And our environmental dispute resolution program works on issues of inclusion and decision-making process that I'm going to talk about as well. So my thesis. My thesis bridges my 2007 book that Bob mentioned and the chapter that I will be contributing to Jason's forthcoming book on the centennial of the compact. So the thesis is basically this. The Colorado River is more than a whole lot of water flowing down a bunch of channels from the mountains to the sea. And the Colorado River is more than a warehouse of resources for human use and consumption. The Colorado River is a living set of ecosystems. It's a living river, it's a living system, and I've actually been taking note of how few times today among all these distinguished speakers, and I don't mean to criticize anyone, they spoke about their topics, but we've talked about the environment remarkably little. And the Colorado River Compact and other aspects of the law of the river don't treat it as a living ecosystem. The Colorado River Compact and other aspects of the law of the river, for the most part, and I'll give some exceptions later, treat the river as that warehouse for human use and consumption. And even that focus has been limited to certain constituencies and certain communities who were there and part of the process in defining the law of the river. So I recognize that changing the law alone is not going to fix the river. Legal reform alone is not going to restore the Colorado River ecosystem. But my basic premise is that unless we change the law of the river to more fundamentally recognize it as a natural ecosystem, we will not be able to restore its natural values. So here's how I propose to advance that thesis. I'm going to begin in what you might think is a little bit of an odd way. I'm going to talk about the nature of law in general, with apologies to legal scholars in the room who might think this a bit overly simplistic, and to the rest of you who might not care about legal theory at all. But hopefully it will come together in the end, because I am next going to apply it to the law of the Colorado River, and first talk about how, and this is something Larry McDonnell talked about a bit this morning, how the current law is a reflection of the values of past generations. And then I'm going to turn to the future and talk about different ideas about how we might modify the law of the river to try to embrace it as a living set of ecosystems as it deserves. So what is law? Law is an institution that reflects and promotes society's collective values. So Cardozo said it's there to promote the welfare of society. Madison wrote about government in general, that it's there to promote the safety and happiness of society. So who am I to dispute Cardozo and Madison, but how do we decide what the safety and happiness of society are? And how do we decide what the welfare of society is? Well, that's a reflection of our collective value judgments. Now, not all important values are embodied in law. So let's say I promise my friend Bob Kiter that I will go to lunch with him. And he shows up at the restaurant and I stand him up. I'd never do that, Bob, don't worry, I wouldn't really do that. But I've broken a promise, right? And a promise is something that we value in society. But Bob could get mad at me, but he couldn't sue me. That is not something that the law protects as a legally protected value. But let's say Bob offers to sell me his car. And I agree, and Bob delivers his car to my house, and I promise to give him a check tomorrow, and then I keep not giving him the check and I don't pay. Well, I've broken a promise, but I've also broken a contract. So that is now something that the law protects as a legally protected value, something for which the law provides relief. And I could give a lot of other examples of this, but I'll summarize it by saying very often, most often, not always, but most often, the sorts of things that we give legal value to which we enforce with legal sanctions, involve money and property, right? There are other values in our lives and in society that might be as or more important. But most often we tend to protect them with moral exhortations to do the right thing, but not with legal sanction. So the second point is that as our values change, as society changes, as we learn more things, as conditions change, we should change the law. And we often do so despite the competing goal of stability. So Roscoe Pound wrote, "The law must be stable, but it must not stand still." So a couple of examples. We change the law when it's outdated or when we realize that it's morally wrong. So for example, we used to have laws prohibiting interracial marriage. They were morally reprehensible, so we changed them. Other times, we realized that there are new values that we should be protecting now that we didn't protect in the past, or that we should have protected in the past and we didn't. So it used to be legal to ride across the country on the Transcontinental Railroad and indiscriminately slaughter bison by shooting them from the train. Right? That was not considered morally wrong at the time. We later realized that was both morally wrong and ecologically wrong, and now we obviously have laws to protect that, new values that we find important. The related question is who decides. So who decides which of these values are important enough for legal sanction? Or stated differently, who is part of the society that we are to protect? Or who is part of the community whose welfare law promotes? And a key word in my opening premise was collective. That is decided by our collective decision-making process. And who's involved in that decision-making process is critically important. So for example, in the past, we excluded important members of our society from that power to decide. So until women got the right to vote, the law reflected fewer values that were of importance to women. So under that general framework, my basic premise is that there are two core underlying problems with the law of the river. One is that we have not made sufficient changes to reflect our shifting modern collective values. And the second is that we haven't included all important stakeholders in that decision-making process. So shifting to applying that framework to the law of the Colorado River, the values and interests that we have found important enough to define the law of the river reflected who had power and what their interests were at the time. And again, Larry covered a bit of this morning, and Ann covered a bit of this this morning. I'll summarize it. But the basic stake when the 7 basin states got together along with the federal government to negotiate the compact in 1922 was to divide the waters. To divide the waters, allocate the waters of the Colorado River Basin. Importantly, their most important task was to allocate water among the 7 U.S. basin states. In the back of their mind was future allocations for Mexico. In the very far distant reaches of their mind was some consideration for Native American tribes. So more specifically, what were the negotiating interests at stake in 1922? So the upper basin states, as Larry mentioned, were developing much more slowly than the lower basin. The Supreme Court, as he noted in 1922, applied the law of prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, as between 2 or more prior appropriation states. And so the upper basin states feared that the lower basin would get the lion's share of the water rights, right? What they wanted was to preserve their right to develop that water sometime in the future when they were ready to do so. And as an important footnote, which I'll get back to later, we have yet to do so in the upper basin, right? We haven't developed all of the water to which the compact entitles the upper basin. Key question whether we'll be able to do so. The lower basin states wanted infrastructure. They needed dams to control the volatile river. They needed a new canal to get around what they perceived to be a politically unstable canal through Mexico, and they wanted an assured water supply. So geographically, the upper basin was not developing as quickly, but it had the geographic upper hand. So at least theoretically, dams could have built in the upper basin, withhold water from the lower basin, so the lower basin wanted some assurance about their water supply. The United States government was willing to support this physical infrastructure, but not so long as the basin states could not agree on an allocation of water. So they wanted an agreement as a precondition to federal funding of dams and canals. So who was there to represent the environment? No one. No one was there negotiating on behalf of the environment or its values. The tribes didn't have a seat at the table at the time. We didn't have most of the modern environmental groups that we had today. We had a few nascent environmental groups, but they were not at the table. So how did this reflect itself in the compact itself? How did those goals and values shape the compact? And it's interesting that the vast majority of talks that you'll hear about the Colorado River Compact, including many that I've given over the years, talk about its operative provisions, right, what it actually does, but we skip over its purposes, right? But Article 1 of the compact articulates the purposes of the compact, and I think they're rather important. So the purposes of the compact are equitable division and apportionment of water, dividing the river, the relative importance of different beneficial uses of water. And you have to understand that beneficial use is a term of art in water law, and it's changed some in recent years, but in 1922, it was defined as human uses. Promoting interstate comity, that's what the federal government wanted from the compact, expeditious agricultural and industrial development, and protection of life and property from floods. So what do you notice about the goals articulated in Article 1 of the compact? They're entirely anthropocentric, entirely human uses. They're limited to some degree in who benefited, and they all involve to some degree money and property rights. But that was 1922. So the question now is, did the law of the river evolve to reflect our changing values? Now, as Anne made us very clear about, the law of the river is very multifaceted, it's very complicated. So I'm looking at 4 of the key major components and asking, did they add to those goals? And did they add environmental goals? And the answer is yes, in part, but only to a limited degree. So first, the Upper Colorado River Basin Compact, the second compact that divided allocated water among the upper basin states. The goals are identical to those in the Colorado River Compact. The Boulder Canyon Project Act, the statute that authorized construction of the Hoover Dam and the All-American Canal, did add a purpose, hydropower, yet another anthropocentric use, yet another economic use, and Congress expressly made that purpose subsidiary to the goals of the compact. The 2 statutes that authorized the major projects in the upper and lower basins that implement the compact, the Colorado River Storage Project Act of 1956, added natural resources, but only on the public lands on which the dams were constructed. And again, Congress made that purpose subsidiary to the goals of the compact. The 1965 Act did a little bit better. It added fish and wildlife, water quality, and public recreation, but only with respect to the projects themselves, so only with respect to the reservoirs created by the dams and not to the river as a whole. And once again, only subsidiary to the compact itself. We also have some special law protecting various parts of the ecosystem, most notably the Grand Canyon Protection Act, which is my favorite all-time example of an entirely circular statute, because here's what the statute says. It says, operate Glen Canyon Dam in such a manner as to protect, mitigate adverse impacts to, and improve the values for which Grand Canyon National Park was established. So far, so good. But then it says, but implement the act in a manner fully consistent and subject to the Colorado River Compact and other components of the law of the river. So once again, restoration and ecosystem protection is subsidiary to the goals of the compact. Well, what about our generic environmental protection laws? Surely we can get solace in laws like the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, and the answer is we can. And in fact, these statutes have been put to good use for some good protection and restoration programs in the basin. But once again, according to precedent by the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals from the Ninth Circuit, the Colorado River Compact has primacy over NEPA and the Endangered Species Act in the basin. So here's my bottom line for you Tolkien Lord of the Rings fans. I've decided that the Colorado River Compact is the ring that rules them all, right? That's the fundamental reality, and you're laughing, but I actually think that this Elvish writing, that's what it says, talks about the Colorado River Compact, not about Middle Earth. Okay, so to return to my opening theme, in my view, at least, the law has not evolved sufficiently to reflect our new collective understanding of the value of the Colorado River and its ecosystem as living entities. So what impact has that had on the river and its users. So the plumbing system that you all know about, the Glen Canyon Dam, the Hoover Dam, the All-American Canal, channelization projects, straightening out the river, armoring the river, especially in the lower river corridor. Many other projects are the direct physical causes of the harm that we've effectuated to Colorado River ecosystems, but the projects are there to effectuate the law. So the law drives the projects, and the projects define or drive how we manage the river, and also the harm that we've done to the ecosystem. And in fact, that harm has been substantial. And I only have time to summarize it, but these are some of the impacts that plumbing system has had on the ecosystem of the Colorado River. Obviously, reservoirs inundate rivers. So large stretches of what used to be free-flowing river is now artificial lake. We have less water for native species and ecosystems. It's not just about amount. It's about what hydrologists call the hydrograph, which is the seasonal flow patterns of water, which used to be highly variable, highly volatile, and now have been evened out. And I'll show you a slide about that in a little bit. We've interrupted the flow of sediment downstream. We've interrupted the flow of biotic materials downstream. Non-native species dominate in many places in the ecosystem, and we've extirpated some native species, eliminated them entirely, and threatened and endangered others. So have we ignored those impacts entirely? No, we haven't, and I don't want to overstate my case. I want to acknowledge that we have made, we meaning the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Reclamation and state fish and game agencies, many people in this room have gone to very extensive efforts to design and implement these ecosystem restoration programs up and down the river. And I want to give a lot of credit to the people who have worked on those programs, credit where credit is due. But they operate within constraints. They operate within the physical constraints of the dams, and they operate within the legal constraints of the law of the river. So I don't have time to give a lot of examples. I'm going to talk about just one example, if I can catch up with my notes and find it. There we go. So the example I'm going to use is the Humpback Chub, which has been subject to restoration programs in the Upper River and in the Grand Canyon Reach under the Grand Canyon Protection Act and the Glen Canyon Adaptive Management Program. And we can say it's a success story. So last year, the Fish and Wildlife Service downlisted the Humpback Chub from endangered to threatened. Good work. But it was a controversial decision, and we need to put it into perspective. So the next few slides come from the Fish and Wildlife Service's 2018 Status Assessment Report, which was used to support the downlisting of the species. And the criteria for downlisting are complicated, they're multifaceted, but the core criterion that was to have multiple subpopulations of chub at sufficient levels that there would be resilience in the system. So in other words, if one population was reduced due to some environmental event, whether it's drought, I guess I can't call it drought, that which can't be named or something like that, or some other pollution event or something, fish from other populations could disperse and repopulate that population. There could also be genetic dispersal of genetic material between the fish. So if you look at this Fish and Wildlife Service graph, what you can see is that there was a tremendous increase in the Grand Canyon population of humpback chub. With one footnote, the Fish and Wildlife Service asserts that perhaps these numbers in here were biased low, and actually this increase was not as large as we think it might have been. But the main point is that the largest population of humpback chub by far is the Grand Canyon subpopulation. The other subpopulations are much smaller and actually aren't faring as well if you look at the population trends. They're either stable or going down. And why is that? It's because the fundamental conditions in the river have not changed. So a couple of more examples. This is showing the continued predominance of non-native fish species in the basin relative to native species, and in fact, it's getting worse. The dark bar lines are non-native species, the light bar lines are native species in the upper basin and the lower basin, respectively. And the river itself hasn't changed. And I know I've kind of mushed 3 charts here into one slide, but they all tell basically the same story, which is that the river has been fundamentally changed by the dams. And we have partially mitigated that, but only to some degree. So this is the hydrograph that I talked about. You can see the massive seasonal fluctuations in the river before the dams, and that shaped the river. That shaped the side sloughs and the sandbars and other components of the ecosystem within which the native species evolved. And when we closed Glen Canyon Dam, here you can see that we regulated and moderated the flow of the river to something that the native fish simply weren't used to. It wasn't what they evolved with. This big spike, I can get there, is the 1983 flood. These are the restoration flows, the experimental flows. Again, great restoration efforts, but you can see that they pale in magnitude and frequency to what we had before the dam was built. Temperature, there's a big gap in the temperature record, but again, you can see there was massive seasonal fluctuation in temperature within which the native species evolved. Once the dam was closed, much more moderation of temperature variation. There were studies to create a temperature control program, another good faith restoration program. Whoops. And you can see that it restored some of the annual variation in temperature, but not nearly as much as there were before the dams were built. Sediment flow, bottom right chart. Massive discharge of sediment and transport downstream, shaping and reshaping the natural ecosystem. As we built more dams, the sediment flows went down. Here's Glen Canyon Dam, much less sediment transported downstream for ecosystem support and restoration. So here is the Fish and Wildlife Service's prediction about what might happen to humpback chub populations in the future. And as with everything else in the Colorado River, it's clear as mud, right? Various scenarios. Under some scenarios, maybe the populations will continue to improve some. Other conditions, they'll decline. And in other conditions, they will plummet. Okay, final wild card, and we've talked about it in the last panel and others, is climate change and the impact on the river. This is another fundamental constraint within which ecosystem protection and restoration programs have to grapple. So you've seen various images about the drought in the past 20 years, discussion of whether we're talking about drought or aridification. But for now, this is the U.S. Drought Monitor's representation of what percentage of the basin has been in what level of severity of drought, with yellow being the least severe, darker being the most severe. It's gone up and down, but it's been pretty darn bad and getting worse. Anne showed this slide earlier for both Lake Powell and Lake Mead. This shows the impact of those declining flows on Lake Powell elevations. The main point being the less water we have, the less we have for purposes of ecological support and restoration. If you're more into visual images, NASA satellite image of Lake Powell in 2017. On the left, you can see how much smaller, how much lower it is in 2021. And what is even more important is what might happen in the future. What are the predictions for the future? A lot of folks are working on this. This is from our friends and colleagues up at USU. Jack Schmidt's in the room somewhere, so thank you for all of that work, and you can yell at me if I get it wrong. But quick summary for future potential scenarios. The upper line, the dotted green line, predicts what might happen if we continue to take out from the river exactly what we're taking out now. That is, if we don't try to fulfill the upper basin's additional share, as is projected in the upper Colorado River Basin projects like the Lake Powell Pipeline and other projects. If we don't do that, and if the climate returns to what it was in the past 40 years, rather than the past 20 years, so a little more of a combination of wetter and drier, or higher flows, I should say, and lower inflows, we won't get much worse, but we're not going to recover. The middle two scenarios are what happens if the climate, again, gets a little bit wetter, the past 40-year record, rather than the past 20-year record, but we take more water out of the river for human use. Or if we maintain our current withdrawals and the weather stays drier. Under either of those two scenarios, combined, oh, and I forgot to mention this, one of the great insights that the USU team has given is that rather than measuring water storage in the basin by lake level and Lake Powell and Lake Mead, a more salient figure is actually combined storage in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So their predictions are, what will the combined storage in Lake Mead and Lake Powell, how much water will we have to deal with, actually be? And it shows that under those two scenarios, we can drop to 15 million acre feet combined, or maybe down to 10. And if both things happen, if the upper basin rests on its rights to continue to take water out of the system, and if the flows continue to be lower, we could be in a heap of trouble, down to 5 million acre feet of water. So the bottom line, my assessment, and I'm an ecologist, I have a BA in ecology a long time ago, but my personal assessment of these restoration programs is that they've been good. They have stopped the bleeding, but they haven't restored the patient's health. And that's been because, number one, they've been fragmented rather than taking a basin-wide approach. And number two, they've been episodic, especially those episodic flood flows. And they've been constrained by the status quo. They're constrained by the physical infrastructure, which is driven by the law. They've been constrained by climate and will continue to be, and that's not something we can address here in the Colorado River Basin alone. It's a global problem that requires global solutions. And it's constrained by the legal primacy of the Colorado River Compact and its human goals. So how can we fix that? So I am going to propose two approaches in which we might be able to attribute more attention to the river as a river and to its ecosystems as ecosystems. One of which is aspirational and probably, unfortunately, not feasible in the short term. The second, I think, is more pragmatic and certainly within our legal capacity. So the first one is the rights of nature theory. And I have to digress a little bit because I am closing out my teaching year, my teaching career at the University of Utah. And it's amazing how much as an educator and how rewarding it is, how much you can learn from your students in addition to what you hope you teach your students. And it's really been my students who have educated me about this rights of nature approach in the last couple of years. Shout out to two students in particular, Hannah Larson and Paris Wagner, who wrote two phenomenal papers on rights of nature theory in the last couple of years. But the basic idea is that components of nature, species and ecosystems, have rights that deserve legal recognition. Now, I, as a law professor, push back on my students and I talk back on some of the legal issues and the legal challenges that presents. So, for example, at what level do we attribute those rights? Do we give rights to individual animals, to individual species, to aggregations of species, or to ecosystem components like rivers and lakes? What kind of protection do we give them, and how do they relate to human legal protections? Because property rights and all rights are relative, they're not absolute. And who represents and vindicates those rights? So another literary reference for you Dr. Seuss fans, Who is the Lorax who speaks for the trees? So some people attribute this theory to Christopher Stone and his very famous Law Review article in 1972, which became an essay in this book, Should Trees Have Standing? And Stone's fundamental point was that throughout history, whenever we wanted to expand the community of rights holders, the community of entities who we wanted to protect with the law, people said, no, that's unthinkable. We haven't done that before and we can't do it. And he said, I am quite seriously proposing that we give legal rights to forests, oceans, rivers, other so-called natural objects in the environment, indeed to the natural environment as a whole. So Chris Stone, 1972, I traced this back even further, at least to Aldo Leopold, and probably before. This is from Leopold's famous essay, The Land Ethic, in a Sand County Almanac, where he draws an analogy to Greek law. And Odysseus, when he came back from the Odyssey, suspected his slave girls of misbehaving. So what did he do? He hung them, right? And what was the reaction of law and society? Doesn't matter, because they were just property. They were just property at the time. They were not entitled to rights. It was a question of expediency and not of right and wrong. And of course, his point was to say, as society changed, we realized the moral abhorrence of not giving legal rights to everyone. The law has changed, the law has evolved. I wish I could say we have evolved entirely in this country and in the entire world to give everyone the rights to which they're entitled. But by and large, for people, we've expanded the community of rights holders. And Leopold drew an analogy and suggested perhaps the same should be true for nature. And he wrote, there is yet no ethic dealing with man's relation to land and to the animals and plants which grow on it. Land, like Odysseus's slave girls, is still property. The land relation is still strictly economic. So has this actually been done, or is this lofty theory? Well, I'm going to give you two examples around the world where rights of nature have actually been applied and implemented. So the first example is the Cabamba River litigation in Ecuador, in which the Ecuadorian courts ruled that the Ecuadorian Constitution ratified rights of nature that had been recognized by Ecuador's indigenous people. And it wasn't just lofty theory. The court said that meant that the entities that were going to harm this river had to adopt precautionary measures, and it shifted the burden of proof to the people who were developing in the river to prove that they would not cause harm, rather than requiring those who spoke on behalf of the river to prove that the project would cause harm. Second example, the Wanganui River in New Zealand. I love this example because about 2 years after this act was passed, I visited the Wanganui River along with my wife, Michelle, who was sitting there. We were visiting our daughter, Sierra, who was a grad student in New Zealand and who I think is out there watching in the Zoomiverse. So hi, Sierra, out there. And this statute actually grants the river the rights, duties, powers, and liabilities of a legal person. I'm not quite sure what duties and liabilities mean, but that's probably the subject of another day. But it also designated guardians. It designated the Loraxes for the Wanganui River to act as landowners of the riverbed, which is somewhat akin to U.S. public trust theory, and to act and speak on behalf of the river. So someone actually tried this in the Colorado River Basin. Some of you might know about this litigation, excuse me, in which an enterprising lawyer in Colorado filed a lawsuit seeking to obtain legal rights on behalf of the Colorado River. The Attorney General of Colorado filed for legal sanctions against that attorney, and the lawsuit was withdrawn. But he made his point. So my point is that I think this is a fabulous theory and something we ought to work on. The reason it is probably limited in the United States, I should mention that tribes have been asserting rights of nature in the United States as well. and sometimes successfully. And in fact, our dean and one of our students are publishing a law review article about that this year, okay? But I don't think this is going to happen in the United States in the short term, mainly because of Article 3 of the US Constitution, which imposes limitations on standing to sue and who has rights. So unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen in the short term. What I want to propose instead is a far less radical solution. And I know you said we shouldn't do this earlier, but is to amend the Colorado River Compact to at least give it the rights that the river deserves. So I looked for inspiration, and Jason pushed me to do this as part of the book chapter, so thank you for that. I looked to examples in international water law, because the 1922 Compact, again, was the product of a prior generation, and modern water law recognizes environmental rights to a far greater extent. So I could have looked at a lot of different legal instruments, but these are three. So the 1992 Convention on Transboundary Watercourses, the 1997 Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses, and then the Model Water Compact, drawing from other international water treaties put out by the University of New Mexico. And what I've done is to give 5 proposals for how we might amend the Colorado River Compact based on these examples from international water law. And I don't think any of them are particularly rational. They're within our legal mechanistic control and something we can do. So one idea is to add restoration and protection goals. As I said earlier, Article 1 of the Compact includes entirely economic anthropocentric goals. The 1992 Water Convention has as part of its fundamental purpose ecologically sound and rational water management, conservation of water, and restoration of ecosystems. So we can amend Article 1 to add to the list of goals to restore and protect the fish, wildlife, and other environmental resources of the Colorado River system and its ecosystems, and we can change the storage of water to the conservation and storage of waters. Proposal number 2. Lawyers know that just adding a goal doesn't get you very far if the operative provisions of the compact predominate. So we can equalize those environmental protection goals against the anthropocentric goals. So the 1997 International Watercourses Convention basically says balance the competing goals in the convention and come up with something that recognizes and administers all of those goals. So we could amend the Colorado River Compact to add this language. The water use and allocation provisions of this compact shall be implemented in ways that provide equal consideration to its basin-wide conservation, restoration, and protection provisions. Proposal number 3, again, something that either Ann or Larry, I forget, talked about earlier. And that's to include an inclusive basin-wide commission. And this is one of the central tenets of interjurisdictional water law around the world, is to jointly manage with a comprehensive commission or some other entity. So we could create a Colorado River Basin Commission, something that the late David Getches proposed, 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. I've echoed that. Larry and others have echoed it over the years. Their charge would be basin-wide conservation and restoration programs so that they were fully coordinated. And the commission can be more inclusive. It can represent the voices and the interests who have not been in charge of defining the law of the river in the past. Proposal number 4, in-stream flows in terms of both amount and timing. This is something pushed by the Model Water Compact, which suggests that states and interstate bodies define minimum in-stream flows to maintain a healthy, that should be healthy, not a healthy and productive basin-wide ecosystem in designated reaches of the system. We could also amend Article 3 of the Compact to require the new Basin Commission to develop and meet targets for in-stream flow volumes and timing to restore and protect the river's ecosystems. And finally, again, my fifth idea, not mutually exclusive, is to expand what we define as a beneficial use. And this would simply track the evolution of Western prior appropriation water law around the West, where in-stream uses have been defined as part of beneficial uses in various states. So the 1997 Watercourse Convention says one of its fundamental purposes is to protect and preserve ecosystems. We could expand the definition of beneficial use in the compact to include restoration and maintenance of fish and wildlife habitat, giving those uses the legal imprimatur and the legal status that they deserve. So I am going to close in the appropriate way for the Stegner lecture, which is to honor Stegner himself. And this is a passage from Glen Canyon Submersus, which he included in his collection of essays, The Sound of Mountain Water. Silt pockets out of reach of flood were gardens of fern and redbud. Every talus and rock slide gave footing to cottonwood and willow and single-leafed ash. Ponded places were solid with watercress. Maidenhair hung from seepage cracks in the cliffs. And a few paragraphs later comes his very famous commentary on what we decided to do to Glen Canyon. He wrote, "In gaining the lovely and the usable, we have given up the incomparable. The wildlife that used to live comfortably in Glen Canyon is not there. This reservoir leaves no home for beaver or water birds." As usual, Stegner got it right. It's a living river. It's a living ecosystem. It's worth more than money. We can and we should modify the law of the river to recognize that. And with that, I look forward to my colleagues' comments and to your questions. Thank you very much.
Nora just volunteered me to go first. So, I'm Jennifer Pitt with the National Audubon Society, and thank you, Bob. That was inspiring, and oh my goodness, you tugged at my heartstrings there. And it's visionary what you're talking about, and I feel like I'm the sort of wet blanket on this because I'm representing the voice of someone who works in the trenches to try to make it so. Like, I've spent more than 20 years trying to find ways to have more live river on the Colorado River. And I am challenged to think about how we can get to any of your solutions. And I want to start by just saying that people don't always understand. I think everyone in this room probably understands some of the dynamics of what it takes to sustain and steward a healthy living river. But we have done polling and focus groups, and people always tell you that that's what they want. But I was cautioned early in my career never to use the words natural hydrograph in policy debate. And that's because people don't understand that just seeing water in a river isn't enough, as you pointed out. There's not that popular understanding. And so when environmental groups try to propose big changes, we find that what we're talking about is so obscure to a popular understanding of important environmental issues that we don't necessarily have that political will. I also have had the privilege of working on maybe one big exception to that, which is in the Colorado River Delta. And when there was no water in the river channel, people got it. And that was a story that was well told in the press. It echoed, there was popular support. We ended up with a US-Mexico agreement to begin to fix it. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of healthy rivers. I mean, rivers might only be 2% of the land surface, but they support 50% of all birds in the Colorado River Basin, and actually 70% of all wildlife is dependent on the riparian corridor for some part of its life cycle. It has outsized importance. It's just that in a practical way, we have trouble taking that value that we know is there in our society and marshaling it into political will to make the kind of changes that you're talking about. That's our challenge. So what do we do? I have some ideas, clearly using the existing environmental laws that we have. I think that has been used to good effect in the Colorado River Basin. Could be better, but at least we have those programs. I also think we are at a moment, we heard today some incredibly sobering presentations about the water supply and the decline of the flow in the Colorado River, and how we haven't really heard from the states who do the management, but this is unbelievably challenging moment in that discussion. I think we're going to hear more about it tomorrow. I think there's change coming. I don't know if it's a change to the compact. People call that, three-dimensional chess. It's hard to figure out how that would work. But I think there is change coming. And to your point, we are modern 21st century people. We have values today that are different than the values that were encoded into law 100 years ago. So we have an opportunity to make some changes, and hopefully we will. I don't see yet any sign that we are going to dismantle the system of prior appropriations, but I do see use of creative water sharing agreements, including water markets, as ways to overcome some of what otherwise is sort of fossilized in that prior appropriations approach. And I think there are a couple of ways to think about water transactions and markets. One is that we need to make sure they should do no harm. So we need better standards for ensuring that these transactions do not create undue third-party impacts to rural agricultural economies. Someone mentioned that earlier today, to tribal communities, to the river itself. We need to have those protections in place, and we don't have clear standards in each of the states across the basin, never mind on an interstate basis, how to deal with that. So I think that's one place where we could make some progress. Another is that we actually can employ water transactions and markets in ways to address water needs in the river, and we have seen some of that. Again, my experience most directly in Mexico and the Colorado River Delta, where the NGOs first, preceding the minutes, set up a water trust to begin acquiring water rights on the open market. There's an active trade between agricultural water users in the Mexicali Valley, and the NGOs collaborated to establish a trust. Today it's managed by Restauremos El Colorado, and have water to begin supporting environmental values in the Colorado River Delta. I think we have opportunity. There are other water trusts throughout the basin. Colorado has a very active one. We have opportunities to expand on that. So I like your vision. I think we need those visions out there, because what I'm describing is kind of an incremental world. And I don't want a world in which we only make incremental progress without that vision. We need to work towards it in order to modernize, in order to meet the values that we hold today. And I do think that we have, in particular, a moment of opportunity in front of us. And I'm now going to sort of criticize my own approach, which is I'm worried that we don't have time, that we're not making the changes fast enough and bold enough to keep up with the harms that we are seeing to rivers and to species that depend on them, as witnessed by some of the charts that you shared with us, the fish not really showing a real recovery. And the other thing that I'm worried about at this moment in particular, as we grapple with unprecedented conditions in terms of the declining water supply and the ever-shrinking reservoirs, is that I think people are going to be tempted to say, at this moment, we can't really afford that water for the environment. Thinking just like in a crisis mode this year, oh, can we really do that right now? I mean, they're talking about having to figure out run-of-the-river operations because we don't know if we're going to lose those reservoirs. And my fear is that the decisions we make today are really, in some ways, irrevocable because it's not going to get easier. I think all the data from the climate models tells us that we may have a wet period again. I hope we have a wet period again, but on trend, it is not going to get easier. And if it's difficult to hang on to environmental flows today, it's only that much more difficult in the future. And that is something that keeps me up at night. And I think I'll end my comments there.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate both the presenters here today and being part of this panel today. I was honored to be asked to be here. I'm going to introduce myself to you. Inyep emoch Nora, inyep emoch masipa. Inyech aha imach yakadum. Inyech aha kalo. Avikwa me ima bunch. Hi, my name is Nora Mcdowell. I'm of the Masipa clan. I also live where the river bends. That's the name of Ahakaloa was the name of the Needles, the city where I live at and where I grew up at. My clan name is Masipa, which means quail, and I live where the river bends, and I come from the mountain. And I am Ahamakav, and that means the people of the river. That was our name given to us by our creator, Matavi. Our tribe was created and placed there along the river, and we have lived there since time immemorial. Our tribe and our people have existed in that place, and all up and down the river corridor is what we call it now, because that's what it became. Before it was free and wild, and I've seen so many pictures from the early days, and I've sat and heard and listened to our elders talk about the river, how great it was and how big and mighty it was. And yet we were able to survive and live there, even before it was channelized to what it is now, reduced to hardly anything anymore. But it is still the river, it is still our namesake, it still is our birthplace, and it's still our home. And for us, we've seen those changes that have occurred there, and we've had to live through them with the building of the dams, the flooding of our lands, the backwaters coming from both ends, and then we've lost a lot of habitat that was there. I've heard everybody kind of mention the willow and the cottonwood. That don't exist there anymore for us. But in the back parts of where the refuge is, that's managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, there are groves that are there. But when I drive by there, I always remember what used to be. But it's changed. It's changed, gosh, so much in the last 3/4 of my life, which is about 3/4 of how long the 1922 compact has been in place. Our name, Ahamakav, means the people of the river. We were placed there by the river. We were given our commands from our Creator was for us to protect that river, to watch over the river, the animals, the plants, the trees, everything that was there that was given to us. It was a gift to us. It was our birthright. And it still is to this day, and that hasn't changed at all. And so when we talk about how we're going to look into the next 100 years of how we're going to manage and operate the river, I sometimes wonder if we ever can again. But I'm very optimistic about what I'm hearing. I've only gotten back into dealing with water again. I had worked and have been a elected tribal leader for my tribe for over 27 years, and I got out of politics in 2007. And since then, I've been working on protection of our water and our sacred site areas, and overseeing the hazardous waste plume that was dumped in about 50 feet from the Colorado River. It's not in the river, but it's underneath the river. But that's the primary project I work on behalf of the tribe. But I've also been actively engaged, thanks to the recruitment from Daryl and Matt and others, for me to be a part of the Water Initiatives team here. And so I've learned a lot also about, what has been talked about, what has happened, what has transpired within the upper and the lower Colorado River Basin. And I'm glad to see the help and the work that's been done, to integrate and include the tribal perspective. And in that, I feel more that it's more inclusive compared to the 30 years that our tribe had to basically secure our rights for our lands in California, Arizona, and Nevada. And Arizona versus California was also a part of that, a big part of that part. But our water rights did eventually finally get adjudicated, and that took over 30 years for us. And I think about all those other tribes and the other rights of those users that are still out there trying to secure their rights for their basic, rights of providing that water to the reservation and to their lands. And a lot of this comes from the compact as well, that the 7 states that are involved in that, and our allocations come from those sources as well. And I looked at, and I saw that line that was highlighted about looking at the tribe's rights or securing those rights eventually, one day. But never did we know, that it would take us so long to even begin to realize our equal rights to that water. And so for us, we're new. It feels like we're new, but we've been fighting for a long time in securing those rights as well as other rights, from social to being recognized as tribes. And so today, I have, and I know that we've gone through a lot of changes, and those changes also helped us in a way to understand and be put in a place to where we can actually exercise those rights and try to utilize what we've been given. As far as, it'll never be the same because to us, we don't view it in that way. It's always been, what the Creator has provided for us. And so to us, we always looked at them as, our God-given gifts that our Creator gave to us, that we were to protect and to conserve and preserve and to use. And we never thought nobody owned that. But when you talk about it, we also have a natural order of how things were for us. And so that in natural order didn't have people owning the resources. It didn't have anybody controlling, who got what or what was divided, but it was equally afforded to all of life, to all of nature. And that included us as humans, the plants, animals, the microorganisms, the land, the water, everything. It was interconnected. It was all a part of who we are and how we exist as people and how we live in coexistence, what was put here. And we've come to a place now, all of us in this room, everybody out there, to where we have a responsibility to change what we've learned in the past 100 years of this compact being in place, and to embrace the new parts of what we can begin to do, because we know we don't have the water. We know it's being overused. We're continuing to grow in population. The cities, and towns that are being created and the uses, yeah, they're coming up with innovative ways to do it and to provide the housing and the residents and everything else that they can think of. The uses for golf courses and other things, we've seen that. We've talked about those things, and then yet, we're a farming tribe too. We have agriculture, and yet, that's been the basis also for our income for our tribe. And so there is a balancing out that we all must do in order to look at how we're going to survive and how we are going to continue. And today I wholeheartedly support and I like what I heard, and it was presented by Bob and the response by Jennifer as well. And that only if we are given equitable rights and participation in development of the next set of guidelines and are afforded a seat at the table where we're having these discussions. We shouldn't be an afterthought anymore. That's how tribal governments and how tribes have not been included. Yeah, the federal government has that trust responsibility, but in order for us to continue our ways in our life and our culture, our values also have to be included in what we're going to do for the next 100 years to come. And now that we're developing these guidelines, our voice needs to be there as well. Our values need to be included in that. And the thing I want to also talk about is that it needs to be everybody's values. It just can't be those, that have basically have been the rule, and how we've had to just compromise a lot and give up a lot as well. We already did that by giving up what we did, our homelands and our way of life. But yet, those are the things that still connect us to this day, is those values we have, the natural order of how we see the world and how we should coexist with it. It was here long before we were ever created and placed here. And it's, we need to, I thought about a different thing I was going to say earlier, but after hearing everything today, and then also just, digging deep into what I've been taught by my elders and by our tribe, and the oral history of our existence, coexistence, especially with the heat. We live in the hottest place in the world, and I'll tell you, we were able to survive, and we still are here, and we still will be here. And other people can pick up and move and go to a different area, where it's more plentiful, where there is no drought. But we are all facing that all over the world today. And even now, it's that much more important to us to think about and how that next 100 years will be. But I also want to make sure that those generations that we represent now and those yet to come are taken care of, and that they have what they need to live and enjoy and, have a life, a good life. I want to leave it better than what it was. And so for me, my envision is that it will be a recognition of the Colorado River for what it is, and all the tributaries of the river, the streams. Pray for snow up here, especially in Colorado, and that that's what we live. We spiritually pray for these things, and that we can work through these things. But it's hard to do when you're not at the table and you don't have a voice. But today, we had the time, and I've heard several people say too, but maybe we don't have the time. Well, you know what? it is time. It is time now. I just want to leave you with one thought. Excuse me, I'm just... My mother always used to say to me as a young girl, never forget who you are and where you come from. And I always wondered about that, what she really meant by that, because I was too afraid to ask her, first of all. But I knew eventually I would come to a place where I would know what that meant. And it actually was, I didn't know that until the day my first child was born and I witnessed his birth. And we are all born into water and come from the spirit of water. Water is the spirit. All life comes from water. Everything you can think about is born into water. The animals, everything, they have a heart, they have a soul, they have a place in this environment, in this existence. They are part of the creation. And so it's important for us to recognize the river as a living being. And this is so relevant today as we recognize the 100-year anniversary of the Colorado River Compact and the next steps that we can create together. Knowing what we know now, and especially what we heard today, we have to do something. And we have to still recognize and respect the natural order and the law should be for the next 100 years, for what it was and what it should still be. We changed all that. We didn't help ourselves very much, but yet we know what we can do going forward here. That's the vision I see for the Colorado River. Thank you.
Oh, what an extraordinary note to end on. Lecture speaking to potential legal changes and heartfelt ode to the river and its future and our future generations. Given the time, I think it's probably not the time to continue with questions. Hopefully we'll have time tomorrow. You all have been very patient today. We do have some interesting questions. We'll try to work them in when we reconvene tomorrow. Let me conclude today's session first by once again thanking our principal funders and our other supporters, in particular principal funders, the R. Harold Burton Foundation, the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy, the Cultural Vision Fund, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and the Walton Family Foundation. You saw the names of the other supporters earlier. And let me invite everyone back at 8:30 tomorrow morning. And we will carry this discussion forward. We've looked back largely today. We'll look forward tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining us.